part 2 of our Beginner Quilting Series, Quilting 101. Today's episode is all about fabric. So I'd like to explain a little bit of the parts of fabric and a few of the terms, and then I have tons of things from the store here I want to show you so I can kind of explain to you what they are and what their purpose is. So if that's of interest to you, let's get started. Okay gang, welcome to our fabric episode. Let me just go over a couple things about fabric with you, and I think understanding fabric itself will help you immensely to understand some of the ways that some of our experienced quilters use it, how we know about it, or what we know about it, why we know about it, why it's important to understand fabric, and why sometimes we stray away from purchasing anything outside of your local quilt store. So the first thing is, let's learn about fabric. And quilting fabric comes on a bolt like this. Now, if any of you have ever done dressmaking, you'll know that dressmaking fabrics usually come on a great big roll. The roll is actually the same thing these come on too, but quilt store fabric usually is what we call doubled and rolled, and it's rolled around this little cardboard tube called a cardboard bolt. Okay, so this is what a bolt of fabric looks like, and most fabrics come bolt wise on 10-yard, 12-yard, 15-yard bolts, sometimes 18-yard bolts, depending on the manufacturer, what type of fabric it is. This one right here, this is a basic. This one is actually from Michael Miller, so this is my old company. And this one is a basic, so it probably came on a 10-yard or a 12-yard bolt to start. I can't remember off the top of my head. So anyway, it's doubled and rolled, and what that means is that the whole width of the fabric, which you would normally see on a tube if it were a decorator fabric or a dress fabric or something like that, you would normally see it on a long tube, and that tube would be slightly wider than the actual width of the fabric. Dressmaking fabrics, decorator fabrics usually come on 60 inches wide. They're quite a bit wider than what we see in the quilting world. And the quilting world fabrics are usually somewhere between 44 and 45 inches wide. Some are as small as 39 inches wide. So it really depends on the company. So that's something to keep in mind when we're working with fabric, is we need to understand the width of the fabric, because that will help us calculate anything that we're doing as far as how many different types of squares that you can get out of that fabric when we're doing our math to figure out our quilting, assuming the designer hasn't done it. So I, as a designer, have to figure out what is the best, most accurate average measurement to use when I'm coming up with how many squares you need to cut and how many strips you need to cut from those squares, and all those wonderful things that we talk about when we're talking about cutting fabric. So this is just a simple bolt, and this simple bolt again is folded, and I have a yard of fabric here that's already cut that is just sitting here waiting for me to play. So this fabric currently is cut at a yard lengthwise, and you'll notice it looks about the same as it does on a bolt. If I were to put it back on a bolt, you get the idea. It's about the same width. I could wrap this around the bolt. So let's look at this yard. So this yard is folded in half on one end, and it has selvage on the other end, which are going to be these white strips. Sometimes they'll have words, sometimes colors. On this particular bolt, they don't have anything. They're just clear, or it's white on one side and colored on the other. This one is just clear. But one thing you'll notice, whether it's colored or not, is it is a different weave than the rest of the fabric. So you can see it has these little holes in it along the pattern line. Maybe see it from the other side, the little holes. So this is what's called the selvage of the fabric. Now, it's selvage with an E, not salvage with an A. So normally, when we're talking about salvage, or the word salvage, it's either something we're going to save or something we're going to throw away. Okay, it's leftover. This is not salvage. So if you've been calling it salvage, that is incorrect. It's selvage. And the selvage is the part that is sort of in a way, the glued together threads that run widthwise of the fabric. So here is the width of the fabric, and while I don't have a ruler up in front of me, my wingspan here, it's about 44 to 45 inches wide, okay? And it's folded in half when it's put on the bolt. If you ever see in a pattern, which we'll get to later in the series, where it says cut something this wide by width of fabric, they mean start at the selvage or the fold, and you're going to cut a strip all the way down from the fold to the selvage or from the selvage to the fold, and that is the width of the fabric. And then we have the length. Now I'm holding a piece of fabric right now that is 1 yard in length or 36 inches in length, but if I were to set this down and I were to pick up this bolt, this fabric is currently 10 yards in length, wrapped around this bolt. That is currently the length. So there are times in sewing, and you may see it more in dressmaking, when you want something on the lengthwise grain or the crosswise grain. So the lengthwise grain would be the grain that runs parallel, the same direction as the selvage, and the crosswise grain runs from selvage to selvage. So pretend my arms are the side of a great big fabric roller. I have a selvage on one side and a selvage on the other, and I have threads running along the beam from all the way, as many yards and yards and yards as it is, all the way from one end of the fabric to the other lengthwise. Those threads are called the warp, and they hold all of the tension of the fabric. So the warp is pulled very tight, and it's hundreds and hundreds of little threads going lengthwise through the fabric. And then we have the weft, and the weft is the woven, weft is woven part of the fabric, of the threads that go in between, back and forth underneath. If you've ever made yourself a woven pot holder out of those little loops when you were a kid, that's the part. So the strings that are already hooked up to the loops, that would be the warp. And the weft is the one that you hook on one side and you weave in and out, in and out, in and out across to the other side. And that holds all of the pattern. It's usually softer, it's less strong. The warp holds all the strength of the fabric. So when somebody tells you you have to cut it lengthwise, what they're hoping that you're going to do is cut it along the strongest end of the fabric. So that explains the warp and the weft. And these two pieces go on either side of the rollers, so everything can be printed. So we're printing lengthwise on the fabric, okay? So you can see the pattern I have right here is laid out lengthwise, and then the repeat of the fabric would be across the width and the length. So we'll get to repeats later, but okay? So this is the width of fabric, selvage to selvage on the fold, and we cut everything from selvage to fold, which is why when you buy your rotary mat and your ruler, you want at least one ruler and one rotary mat that is at least 24 inches long, because that's how much it takes to get from one end to the other to cut, okay? So we talked a little bit about warp and weft. It's really not super important unless you're doing any type of curved piecing, and if you're doing curved piecing, you're definitely going to want to understand what the grain is of the fabric, because you have to cut the straight part on the grain in order to get a curve. And we talk about bias a lot in fabric. So the thing about bias is, now imagine you have your warp threads that are running, you know, pretty much vertical, and then you have your weft that's running horizontal side to side. If you have, so you have all these little threads going this way and all these little threads going this way. If you're cutting something on a 45-degree angle, you're cutting across both of those threads, okay? So let me see if I can explain that on the table. So here's our yard of fabric, and to explain this better, so we're going, here's our length, so here's our yard going in this direction. Our width is going here because there's our selvage that we can see. So when we're cutting fabric, we're usually cutting across like this, cross grain. So we're going from fold to selvage, and we're cutting a strip. And how many strips or how many pieces across, that's what usually dictates our length of fabric or our yardage of fabric that we need, okay? So when we're cutting something on the straight of grain this way, or on the cross of grain, we're only really cutting technically one set of threads, right? Because if threads are running this way, if I were to cut this way in the hopes that I'm cutting in a straight line, I'm really only cutting between the threads that are going in this direction. So I'm cutting anything going this way, but all the threads that are this way are still existing in the fabric. Same thing if I cut this way, I'm cutting across all of the warp threads, but I still have all the weft threads in line. So it keeps everything together. Now, that doesn't mean that fabric won't fray, but it keeps the woven parts of the fabric together. Now, if I'm cutting at a 45-degree angle, I'm actually cutting across those two grains. So instead of cutting the warp and leaving the weft, or cutting the weft and leaving the warp, I'm actually cutting both of them. So when I cut things at an angle, that's where the bias comes in, because everything's very stretchy, and it's stretchy because all those threads are actually coming apart. So that's why we have to be really careful when we cut things on that bias or on that 45-degree angle. And it's also why when we start in beginner projects, we usually only work in squares and straight borders. And we don't introduce triangles or anything like that until we're used to cutting, pressing, and sewing regular squares. Once we get that down, then we can start moving into triangles, because triangles are held a little bit differently. So we get used to cutting and managing our seams and putting our right sides together, and all those, and pressing and all those kinds of things. So we start with squares. So for any of you wondering why beginner quilts are always straight and they're rail fences or 9 patches or whatever it is we're doing, and they're super simple, that's why. We start at the beginning and then we work our way up to the hard stuff. All right, let me explain a couple other things with fabric. Let's walk into the fabric store and see what's available. Oh my gosh, look at all the different things that we have here in fabric. So we have our fabric bolt. We already talked about the fabric bolt. So we can buy fabrics on the bolt, and we can have them cut to size, and we can take them home if we're getting our borders or our backing or our backgrounds or whatever. We can get fabrics on the yard. But look at all this other stuff. What is all this other stuff? Well, this right here would be called a fat quarter bundle, and it is filled with a bunch of different pieces of fabric, all cut to the side of a fat quarter. Oh, we're going to get to what a fat quarter is in a minute. This guy right here is a set of 1.5-inch strips, which are sometimes called worms. They have all kinds of fun names, but they are bundled up together. They're pre-cut. They're usually cut with this little zigzag thing here, which is called a pinking blade. And it keeps the fabric from fraying because all those threads have been cut. But if they're cut at angles, it kind of keeps them together. So that's a 1.5-inch strip. We have this, which is oftentimes called a jelly roll, but it is also 2.5-inch strips. So very similar to these. They're pre-cut into 1.5 and 2.5-inch strips. We also have, these are all called pre-cuts, by the way. Sometimes you'll see strips that are put together like this. Sometimes you'll see things put together like this, sometimes like this, sometimes in these little rolls. They're all very, very confusing. So this is a set of 10-inch squares. So everything in here, this is sometimes called a layer cake. Everything in here is multiple different pieces of fabric that are all cut into 10-inch squares, again with that pinking blade. This one right here is also 10-inch squares. It says it right here on the package that they're 10-inch squares. It's very deceptive though, because they're packaged sort of almost like they're jelly rolls in here, but they're not. They're just folded up together. So those are also 10-inch squares. These guys are called charm squares, and these are 5-inch squares. And there's lots of little patterns you can make with 5-inch squares. So this is called a charm pack. This charm pack happens to have all the same color in it. So these are like background charm packs. And this one is a mixture of all different colors cut into 5-inch squares. So these are our charm or 5-inch square packs. We also have something called mini charms. I didn't really have any that are in a stack that I can show you, but they're just 2.5-inch squares. So they look just like this, but they're smaller, okay? And these are fat quarters. So just like these are fat quarters come in all shapes and sizes in their packaging, and here's one of those ways they're packaged, all rolled up together. They can also come, when you take them apart, they can also come single like this. I'll just fold it up as a little rectangle, okay? So now let's talk about what these sizes mean. I think that our 10-inch squares and our 5-inch squares are pretty self-explanatory. They are for patterns that are specifically dedicated for those size squares. And if you purchase something like this for a background, sometimes it can make your life a whole lot easy because all the cutting for this is done. So our 5 and 10-inch squares are pretty self-explanatory. We're going to set those aside and we're going to concentrate on the ones that are specific measurements so we can really look at how these things are measured out. All right, let's look at our yard of fabric back on the table again. And remember we said that a yard of fabric is 36 inches wide, or in length, 36 inches. So this piece of fabric is our standard width of fabric, selvage to selvage. And then it is 36 inches from the length, one side of the length to the other side of the length, because that is a yard. A yard is 36 inches. So what is a half a yard? Well, if I were just to fold this piece in half, it's already been folded in half once, so let's fold it in that direction. This would be a half yard, and a half yard is half of 36 inches. So again, it's selvage to selvage, so it's folded up, but it is 18 inches in width and 45 inches in width and 18 inches in length. So it's a very long, skinny piece. Okay, so if this is a half yard, then if I want a quarter of a yard of fabric, that is going to be a quarter of a yard. And again, it's going to be double this exact width, right, of 45 inches, but it's 9 inches wide on either side. So this is almost like a 9-inch strip of fabric, selvage to selvage. So if this is 9 inches and this is a quarter of a yard, what if I wanted to cut a 12-inch strip? Well, obviously I can't cut a 12.5-inch square out of this strip. I would need to purchase at least a third of a yard, and with, you know, measurements being the way they are, probably have to do a half a yard. And you know, I'm gonna have, I can only get so many squares out of it before I run out of fabric. And so maybe I need a quarter of a yard of fabric, but I need it to be a little fatter than what I can get out of this quarter of a yard strip. So we get to the fat quarter. What is a fat quarter? If I were to take a half a yard of fabric, which we have here, and let's say I had it cut from selvage to selvage in my 18 inches, but instead of having it be 45 inches long, I came in here to the fold and I just cut it in half, okay? So this is a half a yard. So if I were to cut a half a yard in half at the fold, I would get a half of a half a yard, which is what I have right here. Okay, here's my selvage. This was cut right here at the fold, and now I have a half of a yard. Well, what is a half of a yard? It's a quarter of a yard, right? It's half of a half, so it's a quarter. But it is a fatter quarter, okay? So in order now, if I wanted to get a 12-inch square out of a quarter of a yard, I can do that because it's fatter, but still a quarter. So that is what a fat quarter is, okay? And if I wanted an 1/8 of a yard, let's look at my yard piece again. So here's my yard piece, except I need it in a quarter, right? Here's my quarter of a yard, 9 inches. What if I wanted an 1/8 of a yard? If I folded this in half again, right? I would have 4.5 inches by 44 inches long. Big, huge, long, skinny piece, which is only good for parts that I need that are narrower on one side than 4.5 inches. But if I took a fat quarter, right, which is a quarter of a yard, and I cut it in half, I would then have an 1/8 of a yard. But instead of having an 1/8 of a yard that looks like that, I would have an 1/8 of a yard that looks like that. So this is called a fat 1/8. And I can get 2 fat 1/8 because I just folded this up. If I were to cut it at the fold, I would get 2 fat 1/8 out of a fat quarter. And I can cut them either way. I can cut them on the narrow side, or I can cut them on this side. And they're still a fat 1/8. So fat 1/8 can actually be cut on the long side or the short side, and they're still a fat 1/8, okay? They're just a slightly different measurement. So that's what a fat quarter and a fat 1/8 are. So if you need a bunch of really small pieces and you want to say you want to make something that looks very scrappy, fat 1/8 can give you a lot to work with there, because especially if you're working with small squares, you can get a lot of prints for a little bit less money, because fat 1/8, an 1/8 of a yard, costs less than a 1/4 of a yard, which costs less than a 1/2 of a yard, and so on and so forth. So you can get lots of different prints, but get smaller cuts of those prints. A lot of quilt shops won't cut less than a 1/4 of a yard, but they may cut some fat 1/8s or some fat quarters. And it's important to know what those are. If you walk into a quilt shop and you see something all folded up in a square like this, and you don't know what it is, but it's in a bin and it's marked fat quarter, now you know exactly what it is. It's a 1/2 a yard. So hopefully that will make you a little bit more comfortable with all the terms of fabric and understanding the grain of fabric and understanding how pre-cuts are done and what pre-cuts are. Pre-cuts are a great way to go in and purchase a bundle of fabric that all coordinates together. Some quilt shops, these fat quarter bundles that I've shown you were all coordinated by the fabric company, but sometimes quilt shops will do it too. They'll put together a bundle of orange or a bundle of blue or some prints that they've coordinated that look really nice. And in the case of starting some very simple projects and easy projects that you can pick up and go, like a 3-yard quilt kit set or something like that, having the quilt shop help coordinate that for you might be of interest if you don't feel as confident with color. But since we're talking about fabric, let's talk about color and how we go about choosing our colors for our quilt. So in the case of the quilt behind me, how I started and how I teach a lot of my beginner students to start is figure out what kind of parts you have to your quilt. So let's see what this one's made up of in the pattern, okay? So the first thing that we have is we have the block. And the block is a 9-patch block. It's made up of 5 squares of one color and 4 squares of another color. So I have 2 colors that I want, and if I want to make the pattern itself stand out so that you can see the squares or you can see the shapes of what we're doing, I'm going to make those be bold and different. If I don't want the pattern to stand out, then I can make them less bold or make them more busy, and so that it will hide some of that pattern. But in this case, I chose some bolder prints, and these are what are called blenders. They're not a solid fabric, a flat solid color. They have some movement or some motion or some texture in them, and sometimes, in the case of this purple, a little bit of two-tone. Okay, so I'm going to use 2 blenders, and I want to make sure that they are different so that I can see my pattern. And then I have something called a sashing, and these are the little stripings that go in between the blocks, and that's what's going to separate those blocks so that the parts don't run together and change the pattern. Now, every place that the block and the sashing meet, I have these little sashing squares in the middle, and I only need 4 of those for this particular quilt. So I wasn't worried about getting a huge big piece of fabric for that. I actually encourage my students to pick those out of my scraps, because you only need a couple of squares, and it's just really easy to have that little tiny pop to be different so that you can see that little square. And then we have this border around the outside. Now, in my game, the easiest way to pick colors for a quilt is to start with a border or something that's colorful, whether it be a colorful border or a pattern or a border print or something that has different tones or colors in it. Could be all the same color with different shades. It could be 2 different colors with different shades. Or in the case of this border, this is kind of an all over sort of a watercolor border. and it's got some white sort of artistic flowers and lilies and pads and things like that in it, but it's mostly sort of water. And I went ahead and I put it all the way around, and it does have a bit of direction to it, but I didn't worry about the direction at all. I just cut the strips so that we can get some color up. So this is where I started. I found this and decided that I really liked the colors that were within it. And so that actually helps me choose what's next in the quilt. And I'll show you by looking, well, let's look at this one first, and then I'll show you some other fabric that I did the same thing. So with this one, I see that it's got some purple in it. It's got yellow and peach. There's definite shades of blues and greens in there, but there's some lights and some darks and all kinds of things. So I decided that I liked the idea of using a blue, but I didn't want to go too blue and green because the border itself reads very blue and green. So I chose a purple and a blue, and I didn't worry about matching the color exactly. What I want to do is coordinate the color. So I kind of laid some purples out, and I wanted to get somewhere in the midst of that shade of purple, and for blue, somewhere in the midst of the shades of blue. And actually right here in this little area here, there's that light blue-green aqua that I used here for that. So now we see the blue and the purple. I also see this deep, deep teal in here, and teal is one of my favorite colors. So I chose this little teal right here to be my bold stripe. And I know it all goes together because it's all here in the border, and I think the border is very pretty, so I chose the colors directly in the border. And then I needed that one little pop of color, and I decided it needed to be something light. And so I had a choice in here of going with a yellow or a gold or a peach or a pink. And I found this kind of a purpley pink and decided to go with that. Okay, so I didn't use a lot of purple pink. I just tried to blend everything so that it looked like it was intentional. And if you start with a block of color, then I think because the artist itself has blended all those colors together, it sort of takes the pressure off of you as a beginner to walk into a quilt store. You're going to see tons of bolts, tons of color. It's going to be very overwhelming. And so we have to sort of narrow our focus into what we're looking at. So the first thing that you're going to do when you walk into a quilt store and you figure out what you need is you're going to figure out, okay, so I believe for this quilt we needed a yard of border. So that's going to be my biggest amount of fabric in this particular quilt. So I'm going to focus on that. It's also the part that frames the whole quilt. So that's a good place to add lots of bold color. So start with that and walk into the quilt shop and walk around and look for prints. Stay kind of away from the blender wall at first and go straight for prints and look for a print that you really like, right? Sometimes it'll be something two-tone. It'll have lots of opportunity for color. Sometimes it'll be like a big bold floral, or maybe it'll be a print with cars or trains or something like that on it. And in that, it will have color that you can pull out of the quilt. And then the next thing you're going to do is figure out where the biggest concentration of color is going to be. So you have your border now all set. And now we're going to look at what we're going to offset. So in this case, we have these big squares, right? So these are 12-inch squares. So I know that whatever two colors I choose for these squares, they're going to make up the majority of the color in the quilt. And you can see that, what I think when you look at this quilt, you see a blue and purple quilt with some dark blues in it and a pretty border, right? So this is where the color itself comes out. So if you have a print that has, you know, some green and some red, some yellow and some blue, and you're not fond of green, green probably shouldn't be one of these colors, right? It doesn't mean you should stay away from green. Green might be a perfect place to put here or here, where you have less concentration of color, where you can tie in what's in the border into the quilt, but it's not so much or so overwhelming. So take your color you like the least and put it in the smallest area. So pink, this quilt wasn't really reading pink to me, so I put the pink here, okay? And then find a color you love, and it's either going to be in one of these two categories, or it's gonna kind of pop out and make it you know, more of a bold statement. So for me, I love the color teal, and if you'll notice, I put it in the quilt in two places. I have this aqua teal-y kind of blue color here, but I also have a deep teal here. So I've actually used my best color in two different places. And then purple's not my favorite color, but it certainly is a lovely color. It looks nice in this quilt, so I chose to alternate my purple. So let me show you another option, which is the quilt that we're going to finish together, and we'll see, you can see some changes to what I've done for that particular quilt. So using my theory of picking the border first, this is what I chose for my border. So essentially this piece of fabric is black and white, or black and cream as it were, but it has lots of color in it, and I love that. So it's sort of almost like I was going void of color and then chose to put hints of color. So here's another really good example. This came out of my stash, and so what I saw was, you know what, this black and cream is kind of toned down a little bit, and I like that idea, but I like the idea of putting a little pop of color in there as well. Okay, so what I chose for my blocks, because most of the color for my quilt is going to be in those blocks, I chose to use the cream and the black as my blocks in the quilt itself. So I've gone ahead and I've cut squares out of those colors so we can use those. So let me move this a little bit so you can see. So this is going to be the colors I'm going to use for my blocks. I've already cut them, but that's okay because we're going to cut our stuff together when you're ready to make your quilt. And so here are the parts I need for my block. All right. Okay. So that gives me my center color. Let's look at it again. So those are going to be right here. So I am actually going to have a black and cream quilt, which is fine. But remember, I have this area here and this area here where I can add that little pop of color. So I'm going to go straight to those butterflies. So to make the little border around the outside, I decided to dig in here and find some color from those butterflies. And so I've chosen my sashing as this fabric right here, right? There is a nice bold blue. Again, you're seeing my love of teal, and it's not exactly the same teal that's in here, but that is perfectly okay. It's a nice blue. I think it's going to look really pretty when we put it together with the black and the cream, and it'll be nice and bold, and I love it. And then I have now, back to that little bit of color we have here, here's my opportunity to really pop out some bold colors. So I'm going to do that. So I chose one more color straight from that butterfly, and I chose something on the color wheel that's actually a complement to the blue. So I chose an orange to pop that color. So, and I think that's really nice. It's a very subtle amount of color. So most of this quilt is going to be basically black and cream. And you're only really going to see the extra colors right in there. So once I chose this blue, I had some options. I could have gone red. I could have gone purple even again. Any of the colors that are in this butterfly to make them pop out. But blue and orange are actually complements on the color wheel, and since it's only a few little squares, it's really not that big of a deal. I think that's going to work just fine. So I've gone ahead and I've cut this whole quilt out, and actually in teaching my beginner class, I already put a little bit of it together, so if you'd like to see how it comes together, I'll show you that now. So I still have more to do on this quilt, but let's take a look at the rows I've assembled so far. Check it out. So I have my blue sashing, my little orange squares in the middle, everything's bold and black and cream, and here you go, here's my border on the outside. So it's kind of subtle, there's really not a whole lot of color in this quilt, it's mostly void of color, but we did pop this out right in here. And I'm curious to know, if you were going to use this particular border, what color would you pick out of the border? I'm going to lay it over here and show you in the other camera, and you tell me, would you have gone gold or purple or that bright teal? What kind of color would you have pulled out of the butterflies? So that's just a very simple way to put color together, and you may look at the color behind me and think it's the most beautiful thing in the world, and you may look at it and go, oh, I never would have chosen that stuff together. That is the beauty of quilting. all that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I'm going to recommend that you don't listen to anybody about what you want to have in your quilt, and you go into the quilt store and you pick something like this that appeals to you. If this is the most beautiful thing that you've ever seen, great. And if you look at this and go, oh, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, that is also fine. So I'm not offended by that at all. But you can see where you can use something that really takes your breath away and use that to pick some color. So we're going to go ahead and cut this quilt again. We'll use these parts and we'll finish this one, and that's not a problem, but we'll go ahead and cut it again because we'll try one more time to pull some color and see if we can find something that is just spectacular and blows everybody's socks off, but using the same balance of color that we've used here. So just balancing something from a border print, and that will make you much more confident when you're getting started. I think one of the hardest things for a beginner is color to start, because it's the first thing you have to do, right? When you come to beginner class, you have to come with fabric. The instructor's really not there. So my favorite part about beginner quilting is that the first thing that we do is talk about quilting, and then we go out into the fabric store, walk around, and start picking fabrics. That's the fun part. And all I'm there to do is to guide you and help you blend your color and figure out what you want. But it's also can be the longest part of the process, because so many of us walk into a quilt shop, we get overwhelmed, we start overthinking things. You know, you're thinking, oh, this first quilt that I ever make is like the most important thing on the planet. It isn't. If you saw the first quilt I ever made, you know, you'd go, oh my God, it's just, nobody's ever happy with the first quilt that they've ever made. And so my goal is to try to help you get kind of over that and be happy with the first quilt that you've ever made. Be happy with the way it looks, be happy with the way it blends, and this is how I start. So the first thing we do is we go and we pick that bold print that you can pull from, and then you have a place to start, not only for yourself, but if you want to bring other people in, like employees of the quilt shop or a teacher or a friend or whatever to help you, they have a place to start too, because they know what you like and what appeals to you, what color you're kind of going for. So the next time we meet, we're going to talk about squaring up fabric and starting to cut, and the proper way to cut, and the tools you should already have, because I told you those at the last meeting. But first, before we do that, I want to give credit where credit's due. This particular pattern right here, I did not write. It is part of this book right here, Pat Sloan's book, Teach Me to Make My First Quilt. So most of the instructions are going to come from this book by way of me. I've only changed a couple of things, so try not to go ahead too much, but I will put the link in the description box for this particular book. And then we're going to be making the pattern 9-patch quilt on page 74. This is the exact quilt that's up here on the wall. And what we're going to do, it says here, this finished quilt is about 48 inches square. So it's a very nice lap quilt. You can make it a little bigger if you want, but I would highly recommend not going into the quilt store and trying to get them to do the math to figure out how much more fabric you need to make more blocks. I would go and use this as your guide for your first quilt. So you can make a baby quilt out of it, or a lap quilt for a friend, whatever. But start with this size and make your 48 inch. So if we're going to start with our outside border, that's going to be our fabric E. So whatever you choose for your outside border of your quilt, you're going to need a yard of that fabric. That's what it says in the book. And then we have our two fabrics that make up the blocks inside. So the A fabric, fabric A, is going to be this purple right here. Fabric A is going to be a little bit more fabric than fabric B, which is going to be the blue, because as you can see, we need 5 squares of purple and only 4 squares of blue to make our blocks. So our fabric A, you're going to need a yard of, okay? You need a yard of fabric A, you need a yard of border, you need 3/4 of a yard of fabric B. That could be white or cream, or it could be an alternating color like I've done here. Okay? And then you're going to need sashing. So the sashing of the border is here. This is going to be your sashing, and you're also going to have these cornerstones up here. So sashing and cornerstones, and there's a reason we're doing a quilt with cornerstones, but this fabric and this fabric are both the same, and that fabric is fabric C, and you need a half a yard of that, okay? And then your fabric D is going to be this guy right here, and all you need for this is four squares that are 2.5 inches. So you need about a 6-inch square piece of fabric for that. So I highly recommend that you don't go into the quilt shop and ask them for 6 inches of fabric. I would ask a friend. If you don't have a friend who quilts, just tell the fabric store that you need a 6-inch square of fabric. Maybe they'll pull it out magically from back in their cubby. Worst case scenario, they make you buy a fat quarter or a fat eighth of something to put right there. But they'll help you find it and see if you can finagle that, because you really don't need. Maybe you'll get lucky and you'll find a little charm pack, a little mini charm pack that'll have 4 squares of the color that you need, and that's fine. And if you find one that coordinates, they don't all have to be the same color. So if you have something really colorful, you could do those in 4 different colors. So that's what you need. So fabric A, you're going to need a yard. Fabric B, you need 3/4 of a yard. Fabric C, which is this guy right here, you need half a yard. This guy you need a 6-inch square. And for the outside border, you need 1 yard. And that should do your border and your binding. So if I'm not mistaken. And then if the quilt shop asks you if you need fabric for your backing, you do. You don't have to buy it at first, but if you want to go ahead and buy your backing fabric is going to be anything at all that you choose, a 2.5 yard piece, okay? And eventually, we're going to need batting, and you need about 53 inches square of batting. So if you tell your local quilt shop or your friend or whoever's helping you pick out your things that you need 53 inches of batting, they usually come either on a roll or in a prepackaged thing. That's probably a crib batting, if I'm not mistaken. So you're probably going to need a crib batting. It has to be at least 53 inches square. So that is the fabric that you need. And I hope you learned enough here in this little class that you can go out and feel confident to go pick up your fabrics and also your book. So your book by Pat, the description, the link will be in the description box, or you might be able to find it locally. And I would highly recommend picking up Pat's book. There are lots of patterns in here you can use. There's also a good book of the basics in here, and it has terms that you can reference, tools, how to change your rotary blade, what cross-cutting is, and quarter squares. And then in the back, there's patterns and block patterns and all kinds of very easy projects that you can do that we can get into in Quilting 102. Okay, so go ahead and pick up your book. Let's get started working on our beginner quilt. Get your fabrics. Next time when we meet, I'm going to show you how to square up fabrics and begin cutting, and a couple of tips and tricks on taking care of your rulers, what to put on your rulers, and a couple little household items that might make your life a whole lot easier. So come back the next time and we'll work on getting our stuff cut. And until then, you can find me here on YouTube with all of our videos and also over on the web at cabinquilters.com.